My name is Kelley Currie. I'm a senior advisor at the Krach Institute for Tech Diplomacy. I'm a longtime human rights lawyer who recently worked at the State Department on a number of human rights and strategic issues, including the U.S. relationship with China. During that time, I got to know Keith Krach, who was my colleague at the State Department and who was also working on some of these same issues. We started talking, if I remember correctly, about the hypocrisy that's at the heart of ESG. That it's all about environmental, social, and governance standards and responsible investment and purpose. But yet, some of the biggest ESG investments in emerging markets are in companies that use slave labor as a result of China's genocide of the Uyghur people.
Yeah, and then we started talking about the solar energy. China literally owns the solar panel business, and the same thing happened in the polysilicon area.
It was really alarming to see that there was this deep hypocrisy and paradox at the heart of ESG. And when I left government, I was really excited to have the opportunity to really dig into this from a research perspective and try to understand how this happened. First of all, how did ESG develop such a huge blind spot when it came to human rights? I was really fortunate to be able to teach the case study to the incoming class this year at Wharton Business School. And it was really interesting because, again, I come from a human rights law background, I don't come from a business background, and I'm standing in these rooms full of these, future business leaders, many of whom had already had substantial experience in the business world, coming from big companies all over the United States and actually all over the world. It's a global campus, as you know. And the 4 classes I taught, the 4 sections, everyone was different. And the questions were different, different mix of students from different parts of the world coming with different perspectives. But I think that if there were a couple themes, one that I would point out was, or one that I would talk about was one that they hadn't really given a lot of thought to the idea that ESG included trade-offs on human rights.
Right.
It wasn't something that they really were very that had entered into their field of vision, and so it was interesting having them react to that and try to figure out what are the options for if ESG doesn't work for human rights, what do we replace it with? What do we do instead? And then one of the other themes I would say is talking about political risk, authoritarian risk. We saw that the markets, after Russia invaded Ukraine, had to react. In the past 3 years, as you point out, we've seen COVID, we've seen the consolidation of power by Xi Jinping, we've seen these massive supply chain crises, and we've seen Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And yet these 3 massive events don't seem to have been enough to shake certain, let's call it Wall Street, out of their sense of still wanting to do business with China as an authoritarian, as a dangerous authoritarian country, and continuing to promote ESG as part of the package of doing business with China. And even though China in the past 18 months has been the worst performing major market in the world, you still see, big Wall Street firms, big asset managers really continuing to push for investment in China. How do you explain this?
Well, they're going to regret it someday, and they're putting profits before principle. But what's been interesting for me, Kelley, is what I've seen lately is I see corporations waking up to it around the U.S. clearly and realizing, these are 300 companies lost hundreds of billions of dollars with Putin's bloody invasion of Russia, and now they're looking at China, and they're tired of those parasitic joint ventures getting their intellectual property stolen. They've woken up, and they realize now with Xi's COVID lockdowns, extreme COVID lockdowns, and his crackdown on the private sector, and the potential for a conflict in Taiwan, doing business within and for China presents a serious risk, and board members' duty, fiduciary duty to their shareholders, is to mitigate risk. So now what I see is these most prominent board members demanding from their CEO a China contingency plan. Because if what happened in China, just like Russia, it's 10 to 20 times X. And so, when you're on a board and you have significant risks like that, a good example would be a cyber breach. You have a contingency plan on the shelf. So what I see is these board members asking for that plan. So here's what happens: is the CEO then goes, okay, I'll put together a plan. There's the next board meeting. So he'll go to his supply chain guys and he'll say, hey, put together a plan, a China contingency plan. He'll say to sales guys, fine. So he'll say to all his executive vice presidents, and they'll put together one plan. Now he'll put that together, he'll present it to the board, and then here's what happened. It's not like, just the annual shareholders meeting, we're going to raise our hand, we're going to vote on it. They nod their heads. That means it's blessed. Then the smart CEO goes and begins and executes on it now because these CEOs saw what happened in Russia. They should have seen it coming, but they didn't. And, they were hoping for success. And so when they begin to execute on that, they know that when the dreaded becomes an inevitable, it's time to develop a plan and execute on it. Matter of fact, at the Krach Institute, we're getting requests from boards and from CEOs. Hey, what does a China contingency plan look like? Is there a checklist? So we're about ready to publish that right now.
I have a natural interest in this as a human rights lawyer. Corporate social responsibility is an issue I've worked on for decades. But what got you so interested in ESG?
Well, big focus of mine at the State Department when I was undersecretary was combating technological authoritarianism. And a key technology is clean technology, because the market for clean technology is going to be bigger than computers, softwares, all of that. And, industry experts say that by 2050, 70% of the world's energy is going to come from solar. And it just so happens that China dominates the solar panel business, and to the point where it's almost 80 to 90% market share. And where they manufacture those solar panels, as you pointed out, is in the coal-rich region of Xinjiang, where genocide is going on and they utilize slave labor. So why Xinjiang? Well, the manufacturing of solar panels is a highly energy-intensive process. So the amount of energy that a solar panel puts out in 3 years is the amount of energy you need to manufacture it. So they do it with the two biggest coal-fired power plants in the world, and they're in Xinjiang, and they're unregulated. That's a great example for these companies, Chinese companies that are in the ESG, that Americans invest in. And as you pointed out in your case study, the ESG investment, the amount went from 15 billion to over 40 trillion. And they're in all the pension funds everywhere. And so basically what that means is the average American investor or pensioner is unknowingly financing the Chinese Communist Party's surveillance state, genocide, and also their use of dirty coal.
Basically, what it looks like is that environmental, social, and governance, the E and the S and the G, China is not really a good partner on any of those things, and yet you find these Chinese companies, especially companies that produce solar panels, and the thing that's at the base of the solar supply chain, polysilicon, which is really how that's where a lot of the forced labor is taking place too, is in the production of polysilicon. And you can't, or most solar panels that are produced in the world today are photovoltaic panels that are made with polysilicon. So you really can't get away from it. Even when they move production offshore out of China, which they've been doing to try to get around some of the restrictions that have come up recently, you still have this polysilicon at the base of the supply chain, so it almost doesn't matter. And China dominates the polysilicon production up to 95% of
Right.
that alone, if you look at all the different steps.
Right.
So it's really because it's at that base of the supply chain that it's the biggest problem.
Yeah, that really compounds the problem. And if you look at polysilicon, 90% of the world's polysilicon is used in solar panels. The other 10% is what goes into semiconductors. So now you have China controlling that supply chain. And, if there's anything I learned as Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment, was that energy security is national security. So do we want to be at risk with China controlling our energy? What you did in the case study was you really put the light on that. I think your case really begged the question to the students, should any Chinese company be an ESG? And you can't just look at the E side of it. You got to look at the S and the G side as well. China's the only country in the world that can be on an American stock exchange, NASDAQ or New York Stock Exchange, and they don't have to do standard GAAP accounting rules. Those are basic standards. They don't have to follow Sarbanes-Oxley. And what even compounds that worse is you can't audit their books. So it's a moral dilemma.
ESG investment it's very different from the kind of old corporate social responsibility and responsible investing model. When I was coming up as a human rights lawyer, we did a lot of work on socially responsible investing, but it was all driven by human rights NGOs or by the church or by different civil society elements. But the difference with ESG is that it's really driven by the financial services industry. Why does that matter?
Here's why it matters. And so, from being a CEO of public companies, when you put together your competitive strategy, your business strategy, a key part of that is your financial strategy. And what you want to do is you want to keep your cost of capital as low as you can, right? And so where is the cost of capital the lowest and least riskiest? It is in the American stock exchanges, in the mutual funds, and all of that. So here you have these Chinese companies that get to take advantage of that, but they don't have to be audited and all those kinds of things. So it gives them a tremendous advantage. And it also compromises the gold standard for the American financial system, let alone put the consumers at risk. So it's really three things. It hurts the consumers from a risky standpoint, their investments, and there's plenty of examples of that. It gives the Chinese a competitive advantage because here again, they can play with their books and they can make sure they don't miss that quarter, those quarterly earnings calls.
Right.
And I can tell you, if you miss the analyst estimates on that, your stock price is going to drop 20 or 30%, and that's the time the CEO goes under the desk in a fetal position. So they don't have to worry about that. And then, the third thing is the markets themselves. So this creates, quite a bit of dilemma because all this capital is being funneled under the label of ESG. Here's how it works. The first thing they do is they break their companies into an unnatural amount of subsidiaries for the purpose of concealment and deception. And then what happens is the Chinese capital markets guys will financially seduce the index players like MSCI index, FTSE index, Bloomberg bond fund. So they go on these indexes, and then those go into, for example, BlackRock's 431 emerging market funds, ETFs, mutual funds, and then those get buried inside the $11.7 trillion pension funds that we're responsible for as the United States government. We actually have insurance for
We guarantee
those funds.
Yeah.
And most investors have no idea about this.
Right.
So a big part of our strategy, which we called the Clean Capital Markets Campaign, The first step was to shine the light of transparency and visibility and educate the average consumer and also educate businesses. One of the things I did is I wrote a letter to all U.S. CEOs alerting this fact to go check your supply chain. And I also asked them that if you are investing in a Chinese company that's involved in the surveillance state or military buildup, to divest or disclose. I also did the same thing with university governing boards. I was the former chairman of the board of trustees at Purdue. I had no idea that was going on. And then I also went to all the civil society leaders along the same lines. Then the other thing that we saw happen, when I wrote that letter to all of these board of governors from the universities, student group jumped on that,
Right.
called Athena. And so you had the leaders from the Young Republicans and the Young Democrats, and they have created a movement demanding from university administrations to divest from these Chinese companies in their endowment funds. And, they've modeled it after the apartheid movement in South Africa, which started off in Berkeley, and of course that spread through college campuses, and then all the companies picked it up. That matters because I can tell you one thing: CEOs care about their reputation, and by the way, it affects their revenue, which affects their bottom line, which affects their stock price, which affects their stock options. And I think it's having an impact. So one of the things we did at the State Department is we would put out a fact sheet. So one of the things we pushed for was capital market sanctions on these Chinese companies that are involved in Chinese military buildup. Now here you have all these subsidiaries. So we showed a list of 1,000 companies and then what index funds they were in, and we would track them because it's so hard to find them if you're just a regular investor.
It's almost impossible. I've
It's
been
almost
doing
impossible.
some of this work. It really is. For instance, let's talk about the Thrift Savings
Yeah.
Plan, which is another project we worked on.
Yeah.
More than $750 million in assets. Billion dollars
Yeah.
in assets under management. A lot of money, basically.
Yeah.
And it's the biggest
Yeah.
defined contribution pension fund,
Right.
401k type fund in the world,
Right.
actually. And it's all federal employees, including our
Right.
soldiers,
Right.
sailors, airmen, our spies, and our
Right.
diplomats, and members of Congress, and the
Right.
president and his staff even participate in it. This there was a big fight that we participated in
Yeah.
to try to. They wanted the investment advisory for that fund, which happens to be BlackRock.
Yep.
Wanted to change the index
Yep.
to one that included Chinese, overweighted the index in Chinese companies
Exactly.
and added more Chinese equities into the index.
Yeah.
And it was a big fight.
Yeah.
Congress got involved, the
Right.
White House got involved.
Right.
And we thought we had stopped it, right?
Yep.
Through a big effort.
Yep.
But come to find out that they haven't really changed anything, and federal employees are still investing in problematic Chinese equities.
So can you imagine, this is where our fighting force, our militaries, pension, our civil
Crazy.
servants, our foreign. So can you imagine these guys
Yeah.
going, I'm funding China's military buildup, and it's my job to protect the country.
I hope you're right that reputational
Yeah.
risk is starting to matter, and that real political risk that
Yeah.
they're starting to see this overlap
Yeah.
between, companies that are operating
Yeah.
in political environments where the regime doesn't care about the rights of its own people. Those probably aren't great places to invest as a business owner or as a retail investor, and that we're starting to see
Yeah.
see a shift. I certainly hope that's
Yeah.
true, and hope that this case
Yeah.
study that came from a very odd conversation that we had about ESG helps to contribute to that discussion.
I really think it will, because when I think of Wharton Business School, I mean, that trains the CFOs of the world. It's the number one place where future CFOs go. So this was the perfect home for it. And what was interesting for me was back in January 2020, when I was undersecretary, I went back to my home in San Francisco and hosted a dinner with 35 of the top CEOs of Silicon Valley. You recognize all their names. And it was a safe environment. Most had been there. And I had them go around the room and tell their favorite China horror story. Now, I can't say exactly what they said, but I can tell you one thing. It was cathartic, it was enlightening, and it was frightening. And it was interesting as they were going around. I was like, oh, I thought I was the only one that happened to. And after they went around, I said, look, you know, out here in Silicon Valley, we say corporate responsibilities, social responsibility. It's also national security. It's also global economic security. So not only is China a real and urgent threat to democracy, it's a real and urgent threat to your businesses, because they don't want to just compete. They want to put you out of business, like they did to the United States and Germany in the solar business, like they did to us in the polysilicon business, what they almost did to us in 5G. So the world is waking up. So your case study, I think the impact it's going to have is going to be incredible. So I thank you for that beautiful case study.
Oh, thank you.